Harry Potter could have stayed in the cupboard under the stairs forever. It would have been easier than listening to Uncle Vernon's bellowing from the kitchen, easier than pretending he didn't notice the way Aunt Petunia's lips thinned whenever she looked at him, easier than watching Dudley break another toy that Harry would never be allowed to touch. But the loose floorboard beneath his thin mattress had been wobbling for weeks now, and this morning it had finally given way entirely. The wood split with a soft crack that made Harry's heart jump. He froze, listening for footsteps, but the house remained filled with nothing but the ordinary sounds of the Dursleys' morning routine. Vernon's newspaper rustled in the kitchen. Petunia's heels clicked against the linoleum. Dudley's heavy breathing wheezed from the sitting room where he was planted in front of the television. Harry knelt beside the broken board and worked his fingers into the gap. The wood came away easily, revealing a hollow space beneath that he had never known existed. His hands met something that felt like paper, and when he drew it out, he found himself holding an envelope yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front made his breath catch. He had never seen his mother's writing before, but somehow he knew with absolute certainty that this was hers. The letters were neat and careful, nothing like Aunt Petunia's sharp scrawl or the heavy block letters Uncle Vernon used for his work forms. His own name was written across the front in that familiar script, Harry James Potter. Inside, a single sheet of paper unfolded in his trembling hands. The letter was dated July 30th, 1981, and it began with words that made the cramped cupboard feel suddenly too small to contain him. "My dearest Harry," it read, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer with you. But I want you to know that you are loved, and that you come from a family of extraordinary people." Harry's eyes stung. He blinked hard and continued reading. "There are things about our world that your aunt and uncle will never tell you, things they fear and despise. You have a heritage they cannot understand, and wealth that belongs to you alone. When you are old enough to travel on your own, go to Gringotts Wizarding Bank in London. Present this letter to the Goblins there. They will recognize the Potter family seal, and know that you are my son." The letter went on to explain things that made Harry's head spin. Magic was real. His parents had been magical. There was an entire world that existed alongside the one he knew, hidden from people like the Dursleys. And somewhere in London, in a bank run by creatures called Goblins, there was a vault that belonged to him. "Do not let them tell you that you are ordinary," his mother had written in closing. "You are extraordinary, Harry, and you deserve to know the truth about who you are. I love you more than words can say." It was signed Lily Potter, with a small symbol pressed into the wax at the bottom that looked like a coat of arms. Harry read the letter 3 times before the reality of what it meant began to settle over him. He was 8 years old. He had never been further from Privet Drive than the local shops. The idea of travelling to London on his own was terrifying and impossible and absolutely necessary all at once. But he could not stay in this cupboard forever, pretending that the letter didn't exist, pretending that his mother hadn't reached across 7 years of silence to tell him that he was worth something more than the Dursleys' contempt. "Boy," Uncle Vernon's voice boomed from the kitchen, "get out here and make yourself useful." Harry folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his oversized trousers. His hands were shaking, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. For the first time in his life, he had a destination that was entirely his own, a secret that the Dursleys couldn't touch. He crawled out of the cupboard and walked toward the kitchen, but his thoughts were already racing ahead to London, to a bank full of goblins, to answers that had been waiting for him longer than he had been alive to seek them. "There you are," Aunt Petunia said without looking up from the washing. Take this rubbish out to the bin, and don't dawdle." Harry took the bag of refuse from her hands, but he barely heard her words. In his pocket, his mother's letter seemed to pulse with warmth against his leg, and for the first time since he could remember, he felt like he had somewhere important to be. The morning passed in a blur of chores and sharp words, but Harry moved through it all with the strange calm of someone who had already made an impossible decision. He would find a way to London. He would find Gringotts. He would present his mother's letter to the Goblins and discover what it meant to be extraordinary. When evening came and the Dursleys settled in front of the television, Harry slipped back into his cupboard and pulled out the letter again. The words hadn't changed, but they felt more real now, more urgent. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would begin the journey that would take him away from Privet Drive and toward the truth about who he was meant to be. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it beneath his pillow. Outside, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business, unaware that an 8-year-old boy had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about himself was wrong. And in the darkness of the cupboard under the stairs, Harry Potter closed his eyes and dreamed of goblins and gold, and a mother who had loved him enough to leave him a way forward. The journey to London had taken Harry most of the morning, and all of his courage. He had slipped out of Privet Drive while the Dursleys were still sleeping, carrying nothing but his mother's letter and the few pounds he had managed to save from the occasional errands neighbours paid him to run. The train ride had been a blur of anxiety and determination, punctuated by the constant fear that Uncle Vernon would somehow appear and drag him back to Little Whinging. But now he stood in the heart of London, surrounded by more people than he had ever seen in one place, and he had no idea how to find a bank that was supposed to be hidden from ordinary people like the Dursleys. His mother's letter had mentioned Diagon Alley, but when he asked passers-by for directions, they looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. It was the bricks that saved him. He had been walking along a dingy street behind what looked like a record shop when he noticed something odd about the wall ahead of him. Where all the other buildings were made of ordinary London brick, weathered and grimy with age, there was a section that seemed somehow different. The bricks looked newer, cleaner, and they were arranged in a pattern that didn't quite match the rest of the wall. Harry approached cautiously, running his small hands along the surface. The bricks felt warm under his touch, warmer than they should have been on a cool autumn morning. When he pressed against one particular brick, it shifted slightly under the pressure. The wall began to move. Harry stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs, as the bricks folded and twisted and rearranged themselves into an archway. Beyond the opening lay a street unlike anything he had ever imagined. The cobblestones beneath his feet seemed to glow with their own inner light. Shop windows displayed impossible things, books that fluttered their pages like birds, cauldrons that bubbled without fire beneath them, and robes that swayed on their hangers despite the absence of any wind. People dressed in long cloaks walked past, some carrying staffs or wands, others leading animals that Harry was fairly certain didn't exist in any nature book he had ever seen. He took a tentative step forward, then another, his eyes wide and unblinking as he tried to take in everything at once. A woman floated past on what appeared to be a flying carpet, chatting animatedly with a man whose hat seemed to be made entirely of silver stars. Children, not much older than Harry, ran between the shops, pointing excitedly at displays of sweets that sparkled and moved in their jars. The smells were overwhelming, herbs and spices he couldn't identify, something that reminded him of thunderstorms, and underneath it all, a metallic scent that made his nose wrinkle. The sounds were just as strange, voices speaking in languages that didn't sound quite human, the chiming of bells that rang with musical notes instead of simple clanging, and a constant low hum that seemed to come from the very stones beneath his feet. Harry walked slowly down the street, trying not to stare too obviously at the people around him. He caught fragments of conversations as he passed, most of which made no sense to him at all. Someone was complaining about the price of dragon liver. Another person was arguing about the effectiveness of something called a protean charm. A group of teenagers huddled near a shop window, whispering excitedly about someone called you-know-who. But it was the building at the end of the street that made Harry's breath catch in his throat. It was enormous, gleaming white marble that seemed to glow against the darkening afternoon sky. Massive columns flanked a set of bronze doors, and above the entrance, carved letters spelled out words that made Harry's heart race. Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The doors were guarded by creatures that could only be the goblins his mother had mentioned in her letter. They were smaller than humans, with swarthy faces and long fingers, dressed in scarlet uniforms that looked both elegant and somehow dangerous. Their dark eyes moved constantly, scanning the people who approached the bank, and Harry had the unsettling feeling that they saw everything, every nervous glance, every hidden intention, every secret carried in a pocket. Harry approached slowly, his mother's letter folded carefully in his hand. The goblin's eyes fixed on him immediately, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks under their intense scrutiny. He was 8 years old, dressed in his cousin's too large clothes, and he had no idea what he was doing. But his mother had told him to come here, had said they would recognize something, and he clung to that promise like a lifeline. The bronze doors swung open as he approached, revealing a vast marble hall lined with long counters. Behind each counter sat more goblins, working with ledgers and scales and instruments Harry couldn't begin to identify. The ceiling soared high above his head, supported by more of those gleaming columns, and chandeliers filled with what looked like floating candles cast shifting patterns of light across the polished floor. Harry's footsteps echoed loudly in the vast space as he walked toward the nearest counter. The goblin seated behind it was older than the guards outside, with silver threading through his dark hair and spectacles perched on the end of his long nose. He looked up as Harry approached, his expression shifting from boredom to curiosity to something that might have been surprise. "Yes," the goblin said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Harry couldn't place. "How may Gringotts assist you today?" Harry's mouth felt dry. He held out the letter with hands that he hoped weren't shaking too visibly. "My mother wrote this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said you would recognize the seal." The goblin's dark eyes fixed on the envelope, and Harry saw them widen slightly. With movements that were suddenly careful, precise, the goblin took the letter and examined the seal at the bottom. His expression changed completely, shifting from professional courtesy to something that looked almost like reverence. "Where did you get this?" the goblin asked quietly. "It was hidden under my cupboard," Harry said. "My mother left it for me. She said I should bring it here when I was old enough to travel on my own." The goblin studied Harry's face with an intensity that made him want to squirm. Then, without warning, he stood and gestured toward a door behind the counter. "Follow me," he said. "This is a matter that requires immediate attention from our account managers." As Harry followed the goblin through corridors lined with more marble and more doors than he could count, he felt the weight of his mother's letter in his pocket and the strange, overwhelming certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The office the goblin led Harry to was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were carved from what looked like solid stone, lined with shelves that held ledgers bound in leather and metal. Strange instruments sat on the massive desk, scales that moved on their own, quills that wrote without anyone holding them, and a crystal orb that pulsed with soft light. The air smelled of parchment and something metallic that made Harry think of old coins. The goblin behind the desk was clearly someone important. His robes were finer than those of the teller downstairs, dark green silk with silver threading, and when he looked up from his ledger, his dark eyes held an authority that made Harry want to step backward. But there was something else in his expression, too, a sharpness that reminded Harry of the way Aunt Petunia looked when she was trying to determine whether he was lying about breaking something. "This is the young man with the Potter correspondence, Account Manager Ironfoot," the first goblin said, placing Harry's mother's letter carefully on the desk. Ironfoot's gaze fixed on Harry with an intensity that made him squirm. "Sit," the account manager said, gesturing to a chair that was clearly sized for someone much larger than an 8-year-old boy. Harry climbed up into it, his feet dangling well above the floor, and waited. Ironfoot picked up the letter and examined it closely, turning it over in his hands and holding it up to the light from the crystal orb. When he spoke, his voice carried that same accent Harry had noticed downstairs, but there was something else in it now, something that sounded almost like recognition. "Tell me," Ironfoot said, his eyes never leaving the letter. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Under the floorboard in my cupboard," Harry said quietly. "It was hidden there. I only found it because the board broke this morning." "And who raised you? Where have you been living?" "With my aunt and uncle, the Dursleys, in Little Whinging." Harry's voice grew smaller with each word. He had no idea whether these were the right answers, whether he was passing some kind of test he didn't understand. Ironfoot set the letter down and leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into Harry's. "Look at me, boy, and tell me, did you write this letter yourself?" "No." The word came out louder than Harry had intended, startled by the suggestion. "I couldn't have. It's dated 1981, and I wasn't even 2 years old then. And besides, I don't know anything about all this." He gestured vaguely at the office around them. Something in Ironfoot's expression shifted, and Harry had the strangest feeling that the goblin had been listening not just to his words, but to something else entirely. Something Harry couldn't hear or understand. "The boy speaks truth," Ironfoot said to the other goblin, his voice matter-of-fact. "This letter is authentic, and he had no knowledge of its contents before today." He turned back to Harry. "Young Potter, do you understand what this letter means?" Harry shook his head. "My mother said something about a vault and goblins recognizing a seal, but I don't understand any of it." Ironfoot opened one of the massive ledgers on his desk and ran his finger down a page covered in neat, precise handwriting. "Vault 687, he said. "The Potter family vault, established in 1671 and passed down through 17 generations. Your parents were the last to access it in October of 1981, shortly before their deaths." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He had known, of course, that his parents were dead. The Dursleys had told him they died in a car crash when he was a baby. But hearing it spoken aloud in this strange office, by this creature who seemed to know more about his family than he did, made it feel real in a way it never had before. "What's in it?" Harry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gold," Ironfoot said simply. "A considerable amount of gold. Your family, young Potter, was one of the wealthiest magical families in Britain." Harry stared at him. "Wealthy?" "The Potter fortune has its roots in the work of your ancestor, Linfred of Stinchcombe, who lived some 7 centuries ago. He was an inventor and healer who created remedies that became the foundation for several potions still used today. But the family's true wealth came much more recently, from your grandfather, Fleamont Potter." Ironfoot turned several pages in the ledger, pointing to entries that meant nothing to Harry, but seemed to tell a story the goblin found fascinating. Fleamont Potter invented a hair potion called Sleek Easy's Hair Potion, popular with witches and wizards who wished to manage unruly hair. He sold the formula to a larger potions company upon his retirement and invested the proceeds wisely. When your father James inherited the estate in 1979, the family fortune had quadrupled. Harry tried to process this information, but it felt too large to fit inside his head. He had spent 8 years believing he was a burden, an unwanted obligation that the Dursleys grudgingly endured. The idea that he came from a family of wealthy inventors was so foreign to everything he knew about himself that it might as well have been a fairy tale. "How much gold?" he asked. Ironfoot consulted the ledger again. "Enough to ensure that you will never want for anything, young Potter. Enough to pay for the finest education, the best of everything, for the rest of your life and your children's lives after that." The room fell silent, except for the soft scratching of the self-writing quills and the gentle pulse of the crystal orb. Harry sat in his too large chair, trying to understand how his life could have changed so completely in the span of a single morning. "The letter," Harry said finally. "My mother's letter. How did you know it was real?" Ironfoot smiled, and it was not an entirely pleasant expression. "Goblins have many talents, young Potter. We can detect lies as easily as we can smell fear or greed. When you spoke, I heard truth in your words. But more than that, this letter bears the genuine Potter family seal, impressed into the wax with magic that cannot be counterfeited. Your mother was confirming what we already knew, that you are James Potter's son and the rightful heir to Vault 687. Harry looked down at his hands, trying to make sense of the emotions warring inside his chest. Relief that his mother's letter was real, that he hadn't imagined this entire bizarre day. Excitement at the thought of wealth beyond anything he had ever dreamed of. And underneath it all, a grief so sharp it took his breath away. Grief for parents he had never known, who had left him a fortune, but couldn't leave him themselves. "Can I see it?" he asked. "The vault?" "You can," Ironfoot said. "In fact, as the account holder, you have complete access to Vault 687 and all its contents. Though I should warn you, the journey to the vaults can be somewhat overwhelming for those unused to it." Harry straightened in his chair, feeling something like determination settling over his confusion and grief. "I want to see it," he said. "I want to see what they left for me." Ironfoot nodded slowly. "Very well, young Potter. Let us go and claim your inheritance." As the goblin rose from his desk and moved toward the door, Harry slipped down from his chair and followed, his mother's letter clutched tightly in his hand. He still didn't understand most of what he had learned in this office, but one thing was becoming clear. His life was never going to be the same. The cart ride to the vaults was nothing like anything Harry had ever experienced, and he was fairly certain it was nothing like anything anyone should ever have to experience. Ironfoot had led him through a series of corridors that seemed to burrow deeper and deeper into the earth beneath Gringotts, past doors marked with numbers and symbols that meant nothing to Harry. The air grew cooler with each level they descended, and the lighting changed from the warm glow of the chandeliers above to a colder, more distant illumination that seemed to come from the stones themselves. When they reached what Ironfoot called the cart station, Harry had expected something like the little railway cars he had seen in picture books. Quaint, perhaps a bit bumpy, but essentially safe. What he found instead was a vehicle that looked like it had been designed by someone with a very cruel sense of humor. The cart was small, barely large enough for 2 people, and made entirely of what looked like tarnished metal. It sat on tracks that disappeared into darkness in both directions, and when Ironfoot gestured for Harry to climb in, the whole contraption swayed ominously. "Hold on tightly," the goblin advised, and Harry had just enough time to wonder what he was supposed to hold on to before the cart lurched forward and plunged into the tunnel ahead at a speed that made his stomach drop toward his feet. The journey was a blur of rushing wind, flashing lights, and turns so sharp that Harry was convinced they were going to fly right off the tracks and crash into the stone walls. He closed his eyes after the first few minutes, clutching the sides of the cart so hard his knuckles went white, and tried not to think about how far underground they were, or how many tons of rock were hanging over their heads. When the cart finally screeched to a halt, Harry opened his eyes to find himself in a tunnel that looked exactly like all the other tunnels they had passed through, except for the door set into the wall beside them. The number 687 was carved into the stone above it, and seeing those digits made something tight and anxious in Harry's chest finally begin to loosen. Ironfoot stepped out of the cart as if they had just completed the most ordinary journey in the world, and gestured for Harry to follow. "Vault 687, he announced. "Your family's vault, young Potter." The door was smaller than Harry had expected, made of what looked like solid metal with no visible hinges or handles. Ironfoot produced a small golden key from his robes and fitted it into a lock that Harry hadn't even noticed was there. The key turned with a soft click, and the door swung open silently. What lay beyond took Harry's breath away. The vault was larger than his entire cupboard back at Privet Drive, though not enormous by any reasonable standard. But every inch of floor space was covered with gold. Coins were piled in neat stacks that reached nearly to Harry's shoulder, and in the corners, larger piles rose almost to the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves that held more gold, along with what looked like jewelry and precious stones that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant colors. "This is mine?" Harry whispered, stepping carefully into the vault. "Every last coin," Ironfoot confirmed. "Your parents left specific instructions that the vault was to remain sealed until you came of age, or until you presented yourself with proper identification. Your mother's letter serves as such identification." Harry walked slowly between the piles of gold, trying to understand what he was seeing. He had never owned anything of value in his entire life. The Dursleys had made sure he understood that every meal they gave him, every piece of Dudley's hand-me-down clothing, was a burden they bore reluctantly. And now he was standing in a room full of more wealth than he had ever imagined existed. But it was the shelves along the walls that drew his attention more than the gold. Among the jewelry and precious stones, he could see other things, objects that looked less like treasure and more like personal belongings. A leather-bound book with Potter written across the cover in the same careful handwriting as his mother's letter. A small wooden box that looked like it might contain photographs. A cloak that was folded neatly and looked as though it had been placed there with particular care. "Can I touch them?" Harry asked. "Everything in this vault belongs to you," Ironfoot said. "You may do as you wish." Harry approached the shelves carefully, as if sudden movements might make everything disappear. He reached for the leather book first, lifting it down with hands that shook slightly. The cover was soft with age, and when he opened it, he found page after page of what looked like family records. Names and dates written in various hands, some so old the ink had faded to brown, others more recent. On the first page, in handwriting he was beginning to recognize, someone had written, "The Potter Family History, compiled by Euphemia Potter, 1978. Below that, in different ink, someone else had added, "For our son James, and for his children after him." Harry turned the pages slowly, reading names and dates that meant nothing to him, but somehow felt important anyway. Linfred of Stinchcombe, 1215 to 1287. Henry Potter, 1568 to 1634. Charles Potter, 1909 to 1977, and there, near the end, in his mother's careful script, James Potter, 1960 to 1981. Lily Potter, 1960 to 1981. Harry James Potter, born July 31st, 1980. His name, written in his mother's hand. Proof that he had been expected, planned for, loved before he was even born. They wrote my name down, he said quietly, more to himself than to Ironfoot. Your parents spent considerable time here in the months before you were born, the goblin said. Your mother, in particular, seemed determined to ensure that certain family documents would be preserved for you. Harry set the book aside carefully and reached for the wooden box. Inside, he found photographs, dozens of them, showing people he didn't recognize, but who all had something familiar about their faces. A man with hair as messy as Harry's own, grinning and waving from what looked like a school photograph. A woman with red hair and green eyes like his, laughing at something outside the frame. The same couple, older now, standing together in what might have been a wedding photo. At the bottom of the box, he found a photograph that made his heart stop. It showed a baby, clearly Harry himself, though younger than his earliest memories, being held by the red-haired woman from the other pictures. The woman was looking down at him with an expression of such pure love that Harry felt tears prick at his eyes. "That's her," he whispered. "That's my mother." He had never seen a photograph of his parents. The Dursleys had told him they had no pictures, that everything had been destroyed in the car accident. But here she was, holding him, loving him, real in a way that made the 8 years of loneliness at Privet Drive feel like something from another person's life. She was quite beautiful, Ironfoot said quietly, and your father was a good man. They were well regarded in the magical community. Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and carefully placed the photographs back in the box. He would take them with him, he decided. And the book. These things mattered more than any amount of gold. But as he looked around the vault at the tangible proof of his family's wealth and his own inheritance, Harry felt something shift inside him. For 8 years he had been told he was a burden, a mistake, something to be endured rather than loved. The Dursleys had made him believe that he was lucky they tolerated him at all. Now he knew better. He came from people who had loved him enough to leave him, not just money, but memories. Evidence of their lives, their history, their hopes for his future. He was not a burden or a mistake. He was Harry Potter, heir to a fortune and a legacy that stretched back centuries. "I want to take some of this with me," he said, looking at the piles of gold. "Not all of it. I wouldn't even know how to carry it all. But some. Enough to—" He paused, trying to find words for what he was feeling. "Enough to prove to myself that this is real." Ironfoot nodded approvingly. "A wise decision. We can provide you with a small bag that will hold more than it appears to, and of course, you may return whenever you wish. This vault will remain yours for as long as you live, and after that, it will pass to your children." As Harry filled the magical bag with gold coins, more money than he had ever dreamed of possessing, he felt the last of his old life at Privet Drive slipping away. He was not the same boy who had crawled out of a cupboard that morning. He was someone else entirely now, someone with a history and a future that belonged to him alone. When they finally left the vault, Harry carrying his bag of gold and the precious family documents, he felt as though he was walking toward a completely different life. And for the first time in 8 years, he was eager to discover what that life might hold. Albus Dumbledore had always prided himself on his ability to sense when something was amiss in the carefully ordered world he worked so hard to protect. After more than a century of life and decades of safeguarding secrets that could reshape the wizarding world, he had developed an instinct for disturbances that served him better than any magical alarm. Which was why, when he felt the peculiar tugging sensation in his chest as he sat in his office at Hogwarts reviewing applications for the following year's Defense Against the Dark Arts position, he immediately set down his quill and reached for his travelling cloak. The sensation was not entirely unfamiliar. He had felt something similar 7 years ago, on the night when everything had changed, when Voldemort had fallen and the wizarding world had celebrated, while he grappled with the terrible knowledge of what that victory had truly cost. It was the feeling of ancient magic being disturbed, of protective spells straining against unexpected pressure. It was the feeling of the blood wards around Harry Potter beginning to fray. Dumbledore disapparated from his office without bothering to inform Professor McGonagall of his departure. The matter was too urgent and too delicate for explanations. When he materialized on the quiet street corner near Privet Drive, the autumn afternoon was giving way to early evening, and the ordinary suburban neighborhood showed no signs of the magical crisis that had drawn him there. But Dumbledore could feel it immediately, a weakening in the protective magic that he had woven around Number 4 7 years ago. The blood ward was still present, still functional, but it was diminished, as though the anchor that held it in place had been removed. He walked quickly toward the Dursley house, his mind racing through possibilities. An attack was the first and most terrifying option, though he could detect no residual traces of dark magic in the area. Illness or injury to Harry was another concern, though the blood ward would not necessarily weaken unless the boy were removed from the house entirely. Removed from the house. Dumbledore's pace quickened as he approached Number 4 Privet Drive. The house looked exactly as it always did, neat, unremarkable, determinedly ordinary. But when he extended his magical senses toward the building, searching for the familiar magical signature that should have indicated Harry's presence within the protective boundaries, he found nothing. The boy was gone. Dumbledore did not bother with the front door. Instead, he cast a subtle "notice-me-not" charm on himself and made his way around to the back garden, where a simple Alohomora opened the kitchen door without alerting the neighbors to anything unusual. The Dursleys would forgive the intrusion once they understood the gravity of the situation, assuming, of course, that Harry's disappearance was not somehow their doing. He found Vernon Dursley in the sitting room, planted in his favorite chair with a newspaper and a cup of tea, looking for all the world like a man without a care in the world. His wife sat nearby, watching the television with the same absorbed attention she might have given to matters of international importance. Their son was sprawled on the carpet, surrounded by broken toys and sweet wrappers. "Mr. Dursley," Dumbledore said quietly. Vernon's reaction was immediate and telling. The newspaper crumpled in his hands, his face went through several alarming color changes, and he looked around the room as though seeking an escape route. Petunia's response was more controlled, but Dumbledore caught the way her hands tightened on the arms of her chair. "You," Vernon said, his voice strangled. "You can't be here. We had an agreement." "Indeed we did," Dumbledore agreed, removing his notice-me-not charm and allowing them to see him fully. "An agreement that you would provide Harry with a home and protection until he came of age." "Where is he, Mr. Dursley?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Dumbledore watched the Dursleys' faces carefully, reading the confusion and fear that flickered across their features. Whatever had happened to Harry, they had not been responsible for it, at least not directly. "He's upstairs," Petunia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "In his room, where he always is." "No," Dumbledore said gently, "he is not. The magical protections that surround this house are weakening because Harry is no longer within them. When did you last see him?" Vernon and Petunia exchanged glances, and Dumbledore saw the precise moment when they realized that Harry's absence was not, in fact, a cause for celebration, but rather a source of potential danger to themselves. "This morning," Vernon said reluctantly. "He was supposed to be doing chores, but we haven't seen him since breakfast." "Show me his room," Dumbledore commanded, and his tone made it clear that this was not a request. The cupboard under the stairs was exactly as Dumbledore remembered it from his previous visits: cramped, dark, and utterly unsuitable for housing a growing child. But Harry's few possessions were still there, which ruled out the possibility that he had been kidnapped or taken by force. The loose floorboard and the hollow space beneath it told a different story entirely. "He found something," Dumbledore murmured, running his fingers along the splintered wood. The space was clearly meant to hide something, and whatever had been hidden, there was now gone. Something that prompted him to leave of his own accord. The implications were staggering. An 8-year-old boy, raised with no knowledge of the magical world, would not simply decide to venture into London on his own without extraordinary motivation. Whatever Harry had discovered in this hiding place had been significant enough to overcome his natural caution and prompt him to take actions that no child should have been capable of managing alone. "Where would he go?" Dumbledore asked, though he was speaking more to himself than to the Dursleys. What could he have found that would lead him away from the only home he has ever known? But even as he asked the question, the answer was beginning to form in his mind. There were precious few things in the magical world that could prompt such behavior from a child who knew nothing of magic. Family connections, legacy, inheritance, Gringotts. Dumbledore felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. If Harry had somehow discovered his inheritance, if he had found his way to the Wizarding Bank without guidance or protection, then he was walking into a situation far more dangerous than he could possibly understand. The goblins were not cruel, but they were not particularly interested in the welfare of human children either. And there were others who might learn of Harry's presence in Diagon Alley, others who would be very interested indeed in the location of the boy who lived. "Mr. and Mrs. Dursley," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made both of them straighten involuntarily. "Harry Potter is under magical protection that depends upon his connection to this house, and to you, Mrs. Dursley, as his blood relative. That protection has kept him safe for 7 years, and without it, he becomes vulnerable to dangers you cannot imagine. I must find him and return him here immediately." "What if we don't want him back?" Vernon said, though the words lacked his usual bluster. "What if we're tired of dealing with your lot and your problems?" Dumbledore's expression did not change, but something in his eyes made Vernon take an involuntary step backward. "Then you will have condemned an innocent child to almost certain death, Mr. Dursley. And you will have brought that same danger to your own doorstep, because the protections that keep Harry safe also keep you safe from those who would use you to reach him." He did not wait for a response. There was no time for further explanation or persuasion. Harry was somewhere in magical London, unprotected and unaware of the dangers that surrounded him, and every moment that passed increased the likelihood that someone would notice his presence and act upon it. Dumbledore disapparated from Privet Drive with a sharp crack that made the Dursleys jump. He materialized moments later in the hidden entrance to Diagon Alley, his blue eyes scanning the crowded street for any sign of a small boy with untidy black hair and glasses. The magical traces were faint, but unmistakable. Harry had indeed been here, and recently. The trail led directly toward the imposing white facade of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, and Dumbledore felt his worst fears beginning to crystallize into certainty. As he approached the bronze doors of the bank, Dumbledore reflected grimly on the ironies of the situation. He had spent 7 years carefully orchestrating Harry's protection, weaving spells and safeguards designed to keep the boy safe until he was old enough to understand his place in the wizarding world. And now, at 8 years old, Harry had walked away from that protection and straight into the heart of the very world Dumbledore had been trying to keep him from. The goblins at the entrance recognized him immediately, their dark eyes narrowing as they took in his grim expression and hurried pace. Dumbledore nodded to them politely, but did not slow his steps as he entered the bank's marble lobby. Somewhere within these walls was Harry Potter, and Dumbledore intended to find him before anyone else discovered that the most famous child in the wizarding world was wandering the magical community without protection, guidance, or any understanding of the dangers that his very existence attracted. Harry was still examining the family photographs in Ironfoot's office when the commotion began. It started as a series of sharp voices from the main banking floor, followed by footsteps that seemed to echo with unusual authority through the marble corridors. Ironfoot's expression shifted immediately from the patient courtesy he had shown Harry to something that looked distinctly less welcoming. "It appears," the goblin said dryly, "that your guardian has discovered your absence." Before Harry could ask what he meant, the office door swung open without any knock or announcement. The man who entered was tall and imposing, with long silver hair and a beard that reached nearly to his belt. His robes were deep purple, and his blue eyes behind half-moon spectacles were fixed on Harry with an intensity that made the 8-year-old want to shrink back in his chair. "Harry Potter," the man said, his voice carrying both relief and something that sounded like stern disapproval. "I am Albus Dumbledore. I have been searching for you." Harry clutched his mother's photograph more tightly and looked to Ironfoot for guidance, but the goblin's attention was focused entirely on Dumbledore. There was something in the air between them that Harry didn't understand, a tension that seemed to crackle with unspoken authority and challenge. "Headmaster Dumbledore," Ironfoot said, rising from his chair with movements that were perfectly polite and somehow threatening at the same time. "How unexpected to see you in our banking establishment. I was not aware that Gringotts required oversight from Hogwarts." Dumbledore's eyes never left Harry, but his words were clearly directed at the goblin. "Young Harry has been missing from his guardian's home since this morning. His safety is a matter of great concern, and I have come to escort him back to where he belongs." "Has he indeed?" Ironfoot's voice carried a note of interest that Harry found unsettling. "And where, precisely, does young Mr. Potter belong?" "With his legal guardians, under the protection that has kept him safe for the past 7 years. Dumbledore finally looked at the goblin, and Harry caught a glimpse of something stern and immovable in that blue gaze. "I'm sure you understand the delicate nature of Mr. Potter's situation." Harry looked back and forth between the two adults, trying to follow a conversation that seemed to be about him, but in a language he didn't quite speak. Legal guardians. That would be the Dursleys, he supposed, though he had never thought of them in those terms. And what protection was Dumbledore talking about? Protection from what? "I understand," Ironfoot said slowly, "that Mr. Potter presented proper documentation for access to his family vault and has been conducting legitimate banking business. Gringotts does not require permission from the external authorities to serve our clients." "Mr. Potter is 8 years old," Dumbledore said, his voice growing sharper. "He is hardly in a position to make informed decisions about financial matters, and his presence here without adult supervision puts him at considerable risk." "The young man arrived with authentic Potter family credentials and has conducted himself with perfect propriety," Ironfoot replied. "Gringotts has served the Potter family for over 3 centuries, and we are quite capable of ensuring the security of our clients within these walls." Harry felt something cold settling in his stomach as he began to understand what was happening. Dumbledore, who seemed to know about magic and about Harry's family, wanted to take him back to the Dursleys, back to the cupboard under the stairs, back to a life where he was told every day that he was unwanted and worthless. "I don't want to go back," Harry said quietly. Both adults turned to look at him, and Harry felt his cheeks burn under their scrutiny. But the photograph of his mother in his hands gave him a strange kind of courage, and he forced himself to continue. "I don't want to go back to Privet Drive. They hate me there. They've always hated me. And now I know." He held up the photograph, his voice growing stronger. "Now I know that I come from somewhere else, that I have family, even if they're dead, that I'm not just a burden someone has to put up with." Dumbledore's expression softened, and he took a step closer to Harry's chair. "Harry, I understand that this must all be very confusing for you. But the Dursleys are your family too, and they are keeping you safe in ways you cannot yet understand." "Safe from what?" Harry demanded. "And why didn't anyone tell me about any of this? About my parents, about magic, about the money they left for me?" "Because," Dumbledore said gently, "you are still very young, and the magical world can be a dangerous place for someone in your unique position. When you are older, when you are ready, you will learn everything you need to know about your heritage." "When I'm older?" Harry's voice rose with indignation. "How much older? When I'm 10, 15, 20? When exactly was someone going to tell me that everything the Dursleys said about my parents was a lie?" Ironfoot made a sound that might have been approval, though when Harry looked at him, the goblin's expression remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Potter raises an interesting point," he said to Dumbledore. "At what age does a wizard become entitled to the truth about his own inheritance?" "That is not for Gringotts to determine," Dumbledore replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Mr. Potter is a minor child under the guardianship of his relatives, and decisions about his education and welfare are not matters for banking personnel." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ironfoot drew himself up to his full height, which was still considerably shorter than Dumbledore, but somehow no less impressive. "Headmaster Dumbledore," the goblin said, his voice perfectly polite and absolutely deadly, "I believe you may be laboring under a misapprehension. Gringotts Wizarding Bank is not subject to the authority of the British Ministry of Magic, nor to that of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, nor to any other wizarding institution. We are a sovereign financial establishment, and within these walls, goblin law prevails. I am not questioning your authority within your own establishment," Dumbledore said carefully. "I am simply requesting the return of a child who is too young to understand the implications of his actions, and whose safety depends upon his return to his proper guardians." "And I am informing you," Ironfoot replied, "that Mr. Potter is a client of Gringotts in good standing, with legitimate access to his family vault, and no outstanding obligations that would prevent him from conducting his business as he sees fit. If you wish to remove him from these premises, you will need to present proper legal documentation establishing your authority to do so." Harry watched this exchange with growing amazement. No one had ever stood up to an adult authority figure on his behalf before. The Dursleys certainly never had. They would have handed him over to anyone who asked, probably with relief. But here was this goblin, who barely knew him, refusing to let someone take him away, just because that someone said they should. "I have been responsible for Harry Potter's welfare since the night his parents died," Dumbledore said, his voice growing stern. "I placed him with his guardians, and I have overseen his protection for 7 years. That responsibility doesn't end simply because he has discovered his inheritance. Responsible for his welfare, Ironfoot repeated, his dark eyes glittering. Tell me, Headmaster, when did you last visit young Mr. Potter at his guardian's home? When did you last speak with him directly to ensure that this welfare you claim to oversee was actually being provided? Dumbledore was silent for a long moment, and Harry realized with a shock that the answer was never. This man who claimed to be responsible for his welfare had never once come to check on him, never once asked if he was happy or safe or treated well. He had simply left Harry with the Dursleys, and assumed that whatever protection he had put in place was enough. The magical protections around Harry's home are complex and delicate, Dumbledore said finally. My direct intervention could compromise their effectiveness. How convenient, Ironfoot said dryly. A protection that prevents you from ensuring the very welfare it is meant to safeguard. Harry felt something shifting inside him as he listened to this conversation, a growing anger that he had never allowed himself to feel before. All these years, he had accepted the Dursleys' treatment because he had believed he had no choice, no other options, no other family. But there had been someone, this Dumbledore person, who was supposed to be responsible for him. Someone who had chosen to leave him in that cupboard year after year, without ever checking to see if he was actually safe or happy. Mr. Dumbledore, Harry said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. If you were responsible for me, why didn't you ever come to see me? Why didn't you ever make sure the Dursleys were taking care of me properly? Dumbledore looked at him with those blue eyes that seemed to see everything, and for a moment, Harry thought he glimpsed something that looked like regret. But when the headmaster spoke, his voice was as measured and authoritative as before. There are aspects of your situation, Harry, that you are not yet old enough to understand. Decisions that may seem harsh or unfair are sometimes necessary for the greater good. Whose greater good? Harry asked, because it wasn't mine. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft scratching of quills from the banking floor beyond the office. Finally, Ironfoot spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. It seems to me, the Goblin said, that this is a matter that cannot be resolved through discussion alone. Mr. Potter, you are, by right of inheritance and the presentation of proper documentation, entitled to access your family vault and to conduct business with Gringotts. However, you are also, as Headmaster Dumbledore points out, a minor child whose legal status may complicate these matters. He paused, his dark eyes moving between Harry and Dumbledore. I propose, Ironfoot continued, that we arrange for a formal review of Mr. Potter's legal status and guardianship arrangements. Until such a review can be completed, Mr. Potter will remain under the protection of Gringotts as our client and guest. Dumbledore's expression grew thunderous. You cannot simply declare custody over a British wizard child. I am not declaring custody, Ironfoot said smoothly. I am offering sanctuary to a client who has requested our services, and who appears to be the subject of a disputed guardianship claim. Gringotts has both the right and the obligation to protect our clients from external interference with their legitimate business. Harry looked at Ironfoot with something approaching awe. The Goblin was offering him exactly what he hadn't known he needed. Time to understand his situation, protection from being forced back to Privet Drive immediately, and the promise that someone would actually examine whether the arrangements that had governed his entire life were truly in his best interests. I would like that, Harry said quietly. I would like someone to review whether I really have to go back to the Dursleys. Dumbledore's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment he looked every one of his 107 years. Harry, he said gently, I understand your feelings about your relatives, but the protections that keep you safe depend upon your connection to them. Without that protection, you become vulnerable to dangers that could cost you your life." "Then maybe," Harry said, feeling braver than he ever had in his 8 years of life. "Someone should have explained that to me before now. Maybe someone should have made sure I understood why I had to stay with people who hate me, instead of just leaving me there and hoping I wouldn't figure out that there were other options." As he spoke, Harry realized that he was no longer the same boy who had crawled out of a cupboard under the stairs that morning. He had found his inheritance, learned the truth about his parents, and discovered that he had rights that no one had ever bothered to tell him about. And now, for the first time in his life, he had someone willing to stand between him and the adults who wanted to make decisions about his future without consulting him. Whatever happened next, Harry Potter was never going back to being the unwanted burden who slept in a cupboard and accepted whatever scraps of kindness the world saw fit to offer him. Andromeda Tonks had been enjoying a rare afternoon of peace in her garden when the owl arrived. Ted was at the ministry, working late on some complicated legal matter involving Muggle-born registration procedures, and Nymphadora was safely at Hogwarts for the autumn term. The house felt pleasantly quiet, and Andromeda had been taking advantage of the solitude to tend to her late-blooming roses. The owl was unfamiliar, a sleek grey creature that circled twice before landing on her garden gate. It carried no letter, which struck her as odd. But when she approached to see if it was injured or lost, it fixed her with intelligent amber eyes and spoke in a voice that was distinctly goblin. "Andromeda Tonks ne Black." She straightened immediately, her gardening forgotten. Very few people called her by her maiden name these days, and none of them were goblins. "Yes." "You are requested to attend Gringotts Wizarding Bank at your earliest convenience. A matter has arisen concerning the Black family estates that requires your immediate attention." "What sort of matter?" Andromeda asked, but the owl was already spreading its wings. "Account Manager Ironfoot will explain upon your arrival," it said, and took flight without waiting for a response. Andromeda stared after it, her mind racing. She had been disowned from the Black family nearly 20 years ago, cut off from any claim to their estates or inheritance. Her name had been blasted from the family tapestry with such thoroughness that her sisters sometimes acted as though she had never existed at all. What could Gringotts possibly want with her concerning Black family matters? But curiosity, and a healthy suspicion that whatever was happening might affect her own small family, compelled her to disapparate from her garden and materialize outside the imposing white marble facade of Gringotts within the hour. The goblin who met her in the lobby was not one she recognized, but his manner was respectful enough as he led her through corridors that were busier than usual for late afternoon. Andromeda noticed several witches and wizards in formal robes, hurrying past with expressions of barely controlled agitation, and she wondered what sort of crisis could have stirred up this level of activity. Account Manager Ironfoot's office was larger than she had expected, and when she entered, she found herself in the middle of what appeared to be a very tense standoff. Albus Dumbledore stood near the window, his usually serene expression marred by obvious frustration. Ironfoot sat behind his desk with the controlled stillness of a predator prepared to strike, and in a chair that was clearly too large for him sat a small boy with untidy black hair and the most vivid green eyes Andromeda had ever seen. She knew immediately who he was, even though she had never seen him before. The resemblance to James Potter was unmistakable. But those eyes, those were Lily Evans's eyes, and they were currently fixed on her with a mixture of hope and desperate curiosity. "Mrs. Tonks," Ironfoot said, rising from his chair with evident relief. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I believe you may be able to provide some insight into a rather complex situation." Dumbledore turned from the window, his blue eyes sharp behind his half-moon spectacles. "Andromeda, I was not aware that you had been contacted regarding this matter." "Neither was I," she replied evenly. "Perhaps someone could explain exactly what this matter is." Ironfoot gestured toward Harry, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child who had learned to listen for clues about his own fate in adult conversations. Young Mr. Potter presented himself at Gringotts this afternoon with authentic documentation granting him access to his family vault. Headmaster Dumbledore believes that he should be returned immediately to his current guardians. Mr. Potter has expressed reluctance to return to said guardians. The situation has reached an impasse. Andromeda looked more closely at Harry, taking in details that painted a picture she found deeply disturbing. His clothes were too large, clearly hand-me-downs from a much bigger child. He was small for 8 years old, with the kind of thinness that spoke of inadequate nutrition rather than natural build. And there was something in his posture, a wariness that no child should have learned so young. "Who are his current guardians?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "His maternal aunt and her husband," Dumbledore said. "They have provided him with a home since his parents' deaths." "The Dursleys," Harry said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They hate magic. They hate me." The simple way he said it, without self-pity, but with absolute conviction, made Andromeda's chest tighten with anger. She had grown up in a house where she was despised for her opinions and her choices, and she recognized that particular tone of resigned acceptance in a child who had learned not to expect kindness. "And you, Mr. Potter," she said gently, "what would you prefer to happen?" Harry's green eyes widened slightly, as though no adult had ever asked his opinion about his own life before. "I don't want to go back there," he said. "I want to stay somewhere that I'm wanted. Somewhere that people don't mind that I exist." The words were devastating in their simplicity, and Andromeda saw Dumbledore wince slightly. But the old wizard's voice remained firm when he spoke. "Harry's safety depends upon very specific magical protections that are tied to his blood relationship with his aunt. Those protections cannot be replicated elsewhere." "Cannot?" Andromeda repeated, raising an eyebrow, "or simply would require different arrangements." "The magic involved is ancient and complex," Dumbledore said. "It has kept Harry safe for 7 years." "Safe from whom?" Andromeda asked. "Voldemort is gone. His followers are in Azkaban or have fled the country. What danger could possibly require an 8-year-old to endure years of neglect and emotional abuse?" "You speak of things you do not fully understand," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a warning edge. Andromeda met his gaze steadily. "I understand enough. I understand that this child has been placed with people who despise him for his magical nature, and I understand that he has been kept ignorant of his heritage and his rights. I also understand that there are alternatives to leaving him in such a situation." "Such as?" Ironfoot asked, his dark eyes glittering with interest. Andromeda looked at Harry, who was watching her with an expression of desperate hope that made her heart ache. She thought of her own daughter, safe and happy at Hogwarts, surrounded by friends and teachers who valued her for exactly who she was. She thought of the years she had spent as an unwanted daughter in a house that valued blood purity above human decency. And she thought of all the children who had nowhere else to turn, such as placing him with family members who would actually want him, she said quietly. Dumbledore's expression grew thunderous. "Harry has no other family. The Dursleys are his only living relatives." The Dursleys are his only living blood relatives, Andromeda corrected. But the Potters and the Blacks have been connected by marriage and friendship for generations. Sirius Black is Harry's godfather, even if he is currently unable to fulfill that role. And I am Sirius's cousin. She turned to Harry, whose eyes had grown even wider. More than that, young man, your mother was a remarkable woman who showed kindness to people who had never experienced it before. She was James Potter's wife, and James was one of the best friends my cousin ever had. That makes you family, in every way that matters. You would take me in? Harry asked, his voice barely audible. My husband and I would be honored to provide you with a home, Andromeda said firmly. A real home, where your magic is celebrated rather than despised, where you can learn about your heritage and your parents, where you would be wanted and loved. This is highly irregular, Dumbledore said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was not entirely opposed to the idea. So is leaving a child in an abusive situation when alternatives are available, Andromeda replied. My husband is a respected member of the Ministry's legal department. I am a qualified healer. We have successfully raised one magical child already, and we are more than capable of providing Harry with the kind of home he deserves. Ironfoot made a note in one of his ledgers. Mrs. Tonks raises an excellent point regarding alternative family arrangements. The connection between the Black and Potter families is well documented in our genealogical records. There are protections to consider, Dumbledore said, but his tone was more thoughtful now than adamant. Then we will consider them, Andromeda said, but we will not use them as an excuse to condemn a child to years of misery when other options exist. She knelt beside Harry's chair, bringing herself to his eye level. Harry, I want you to understand that this decision is yours to make. If you would prefer to stay with the Dursleys, or if you would rather wait until you are older to make such a choice, that is entirely your right. But if you would like to come home with me, to live with a family who understands what it means to be magical, and who would be proud to call you our son, that option is available to you. Harry stared at her for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face as though looking for some sign that this was too good to be true. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was steady despite his obvious emotion. I would like that very much, he said. I would like to have a family that wants me. Andromeda smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn since arriving at Gringotts. Then that's exactly what you'll have. As she straightened and turned back to Dumbledore and Ironfoot, Andromeda felt the familiar sense of righteous determination that had carried her through her own escape from a toxic family situation 20 years earlier. Harry Potter would not spend another night in a house where he was unwanted, if she had anything to say about it. Now then, she said briskly, what exactly do we need to do to make this arrangement official? Minerva McGonagall had received many urgent summons in her years as Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts, but none that had filled her with quite the same sense of dread as the message that had arrived during her evening meal. Dumbledore's note had been brief to the point of terseness. Your immediate presence required at Gringotts regarding Harry Potter's welfare. Situation delicate. She had disapparated immediately, abandoning her dinner and her marking without a second thought. If Harry Potter was at Gringotts, Harry Potter, who should have been safely tucked away with his relatives in Surrey, then something had gone seriously wrong with the careful arrangements that had governed the boy's life for the past 7 years. The scene that greeted her in Account Manager Ironfoot's office was both better and worse than she had feared. Harry was clearly unharmed, seated in an oversized chair with his small hands clutching what appeared to be family photographs. But the tension in the room was palpable, and the way the boy's eyes tracked every movement suggested a wariness that no 8-year-old should have learned. "Minerva," Dumbledore said, rising from his chair with obvious relief. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Headmaster," she replied, her gaze moving between Dumbledore, the Goblin account manager, and a woman she recognized as Andromeda Tonks. Perhaps someone could explain why young Mr. Potter is here instead of safely at home with his guardians. "That," said Mrs. Tonks with a slight edge to her voice, "is precisely the question we have been attempting to resolve." McGonagall looked more closely at Harry, and what she saw made her lips press into a thin line. The boy was small for his age, smaller than he should have been at 8 years old. His clothes were clean but ill-fitting, clearly hand-me-downs from someone considerably larger. There were no obvious signs of physical abuse, but there was something in his posture, a careful stillness that spoke of a child who had learned not to draw attention to himself. "Mr. Potter," she said gently, moving to crouch beside his chair so that she could speak to him at eye level. "I am Professor McGonagall. I work with Professor Dumbledore at Hogwarts. How are you feeling?" Harry's green eyes studied her face with an intensity that was unnerving. "Are you here to make me go back to the Dursleys?" The question was asked without self-pity, but with a resignation that made McGonagall's heart clench. "I am here to make sure that you are safe and well cared for," she said carefully. "Can you tell me about your life with the Dursleys?" Harry glanced at Dumbledore, then at Mrs. Tonks, as though seeking permission to speak truthfully. When no one objected, he began to talk in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice that was somehow more devastating than tears would have been. "They don't like me very much," he said. "Uncle Vernon says I'm a burden they have to put up with because they're good people. Aunt Petunia doesn't like to look at me because I remind her of my mother. Dudley breaks things and blames me for it. And then I get punished." "What sort of punishments?" McGonagall asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No meals, mostly. Sometimes I have to stay in my cupboard for a whole day. Uncle Vernon shouts a lot, but he doesn't hit me or anything like that." "Your cupboard?" Harry nodded, as though this were perfectly normal. "I sleep in the cupboard under the stairs. It's not too bad, except when there are spiders." McGonagall felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had spent 30 years working with children, and she had developed a keen sense for the signs of neglect and emotional abuse. Everything about Harry Potter, from his small stature to his careful manner of speaking to his acceptance of living conditions that no child should have to endure, painted a picture of systematic mistreatment. "Harry," she said gently, "have the Dursleys ever told you anything about your parents?" "They said they died in a car crash because my father was a drunk," Harry said. "They said my mother was a freak who got herself and my father killed with her abnormality. But that's not true, is it? The letter from my mother says they were magical, and that I'm magical too." McGonagall closed her eyes briefly. She remembered Lily and James Potter as students, bright, talented, brave young people who had died protecting their son. The idea that their memory had been so thoroughly poisoned in Harry's mind was almost unbearable. "Your parents were extraordinary people," she said firmly. "They were brave and kind and powerful, and they loved you very much. They died protecting you from a very dangerous dark wizard, not in a car crash." "The Dursleys lied to me about everything," Harry said, and there was a note of hurt in his voice that he was trying hard to hide. "About my parents, about magic, about the money they left for me. They made me think I was worthless." "You are not worthless," McGonagall said with fierce conviction. "You are Harry Potter, son of two of the finest people I ever had the privilege to teach, and you have every right to know the truth about who you are." She stood and turned to face Dumbledore, her expression stern. "Albus, I need to speak with you privately." Dumbledore's blue eyes met hers, and she saw resignation in them. "Of course." They stepped into the corridor outside Ironfoot's office, leaving Harry with Mrs. Tonks and the goblin. McGonagall waited until she was certain they were out of earshot before speaking. "How long have you known about his living conditions?" "Minerva." "How long?" she repeated, her voice sharp with suppressed anger. Dumbledore sighed heavily. "I have been aware that the Dursleys are not ideal guardians, but the protections that keep Harry safe require his presence in their home. Living in a cupboard, Albus? Being told that his parents were drunken freaks? Being starved as punishment for things he didn't do?" McGonagall's voice was rising, despite her efforts to keep it low. "That child has been emotionally abused for 7 years, and you knew about it. The magical protections are not worth condemning an innocent child to a childhood of neglect and emotional torment," McGonagall snapped. "I have seen the signs, Albus. I have spent my career working with children, and I know what systematic mistreatment looks like. That boy has learned not to expect kindness, not to ask for help, not to believe that he deserves better treatment. Those are not the lessons we should be teaching the child we claim to be protecting." Dumbledore was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired. "What would you have me do, Minerva? The Blood Ward protections are real, and they have kept him safe from those who would harm him. Safe from external threats, perhaps, but not safe from the harm being done to him every day in that house." McGonagall's tone softened slightly, but her conviction remained firm. "You know as well as I do that there are other forms of protection, other ways to keep a child safe that do not require him to endure years of emotional abuse." "Mrs. Tonks has offered to provide alternative guardianship," Dumbledore said quietly. "And what is your objection to that arrangement?" "The blood protection can be supplemented with other forms of magical protection," McGonagall interrupted. "You and I both know that there are ways to safeguard a child that do not depend entirely upon blood magic. The question is whether you are willing to consider them." Dumbledore looked through the office window at Harry, who was showing Mrs. Tonks's photographs with something approaching shy enthusiasm. "He does seem happier in the past hour than I have ever seen him." "Because someone is showing him kindness without expecting anything in return," McGonagall said. "Because someone is treating him like a child who deserves care and attention instead of a burden to be endured." She paused, then continued in a gentler tone. "Albus, I understand your concerns about his safety. I share them. But we cannot protect his body while destroying his spirit. That boy deserves to know what it feels like to be wanted, to be loved, to have adults in his life who see his well-being as important." Through the office window, they could see Mrs. Tonks kneeling beside Harry's chair, listening intently as he pointed to something in one of his photographs. Harry's face was more animated than McGonagall had ever seen it, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like hope. "As Deputy Headmistress," McGonagall said quietly, "it is my responsibility to ensure the welfare of students under Hogwarts's care. While Harry is not yet officially enrolled, he is certainly within our sphere of concern, and as someone who knew and respected his parents, I cannot in good conscience recommend that he be returned to a situation where his emotional and psychological well-being are being systematically undermined." Dumbledore was quiet for a long time, his blue eyes fixed on Harry's animated face. Finally, he sighed. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend that we give Mrs. Tonks the opportunity to provide Harry with the kind of home he should have had from the beginning," McGonagall said firmly. "A home where he is wanted and valued, where his magical heritage is celebrated rather than reviled, where he can grow up knowing the truth about his parents and his own worth." "And the protections?" We adapt them. We find new ways to keep him safe that do not require him to sacrifice his childhood on the altar of security. McGonagall's voice softened. Albus, that child has been protecting everyone else for 7 years, simply by enduring an intolerable situation. Perhaps it is time for us to protect him. As they returned to the office, McGonagall felt the familiar weight of professional responsibility settling around her shoulders. But for once, that weight felt lighter rather than heavier. For once, she was confident that she was advocating for the right course of action, regardless of how complicated it might make their carefully laid plans. Harry Potter deserved a childhood, and if it was within her power to ensure that he got one, then that was exactly what she intended to do. The Tonks house was nothing like what Harry had expected a magical home to look like. It was not filled with bubbling cauldrons or floating objects or any of the dramatic magical displays he had seen in Diagon Alley. Instead, it looked remarkably normal from the outside, a comfortable 2-story home with a well-tended garden and cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. But the moment Andromeda opened the front door, Harry could feel the difference. It was in the way she smiled at him, genuine and welcoming, as she ushered him inside. It was in the warm light that seemed to emanate from every room, and the sense of peace that settled over him like a blanket as he crossed the threshold. "Ted," Andromeda called as she hung up her cloak, "we have a guest." The man who emerged from what appeared to be a kitchen was exactly as the Goblin records had described him. Fair-haired and big-bellied, with a kind face that immediately put Harry at ease. But it was his smile that made Harry's chest feel tight with something he couldn't quite name. No adult had ever looked at him the way Ted Tonks did in that moment, with genuine pleasure and interest rather than obligation or annoyance. "So you're Harry Potter," Ted said, crouching down to Harry's eye level, with an ease that suggested he was well practiced in talking to children. "I've heard quite a lot about you, young man. All of it good, I promise." "You have?" Harry asked, genuinely surprised. "Of course we have," Ted said warmly. "Your parents were remarkable people, and from what Andromeda tells me, you're following in their footsteps quite admirably." Harry felt his cheeks burn. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not from adults who seemed to mean them. "I don't know if I'm remarkable," he said quietly. "I'm just me." "Just you is quite remarkable enough," Ted said firmly. "Now, I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Would you like some dinner?" The kitchen was the heart of the house, Harry realized as Ted led him through the doorway. It was warm and bright, with copper pots hanging from hooks and herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill. The table was already set for 4, as though they had been expecting him, and the smell of something delicious filled the air. "4 places?" Harry asked, looking around. "Nymphadora is coming home from school for the weekend," Andromeda explained, ladling what looked like beef stew into bowls. "She's quite excited to meet you." Harry's stomach rumbled loudly, and he realized that he hadn't eaten since the previous evening. The Dursleys had been too busy shouting at each other that morning to remember to give him breakfast, and he had been too nervous and excited about his adventure to think about food. "Sit wherever you'd like," Ted said, gesturing to the chairs around the table. Harry chose a seat carefully, still half expecting someone to tell him he was in the wrong place, or that he should wait until the real family had finished eating. But Ted and Andromeda simply sat down as well, and Andromeda pushed a bowl of stew toward him with a smile. "Eat up," she said. "You look as though you could use a good meal." The stew was unlike anything Harry had ever tasted. The Dursleys' idea of cooking extended to opening tins and heating things up in the microwave, and Harry's own culinary experience was limited to the simple meals he had learned to prepare for himself when they forgot to feed him. But this was what food was supposed to taste like when it was made by someone who cared about the people eating it. "This is really good," he said, taking another spoonful. "Thank you," Andromeda said. "It's nothing fancy, just an old family recipe." "Our family recipes," Ted added with a grin, "tend to be a bit more magical than most." As if on cue, the salt and pepper shakers began moving across the table of their own accord, positioning themselves helpfully near Harry's bowl. Harry stared at them in wonder. "The house has been enchanted to be helpful," Ted explained. "Nothing dramatic, just little things to make life easier. The dishes wash themselves, the laundry folds itself, that sort of thing." "But doesn't the Ministry have rules about magic in Muggle areas?" Harry asked, remembering something he had overheard at Gringotts. "We live in a magical neighborhood," Andromeda said. "Most of our neighbors are witches and wizards, so we don't have to worry about Muggles seeing anything unusual. It's one of the advantages of living in a mixed community." Harry tried to imagine what it would be like to grow up in a house where magic was normal, where helpful enchantments were just part of daily life, where no one yelled at you for accidentally making strange things happen. It seemed like something out of a fairy tale. "Harry," Ted said gently, "Andromeda told me a bit about your living situation with the Dursleys. I want you to know that you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But if you ever do want to talk, we're here to listen." "They really didn't like me," Harry said quietly, surprised by his own willingness to speak. "They said my parents were freaks who got themselves killed, and that I was probably going to turn out the same way." "That must have been very hard to hear," Andromeda said, her voice gentle, but with an edge of anger that wasn't directed at Harry. "I used to think it was true," Harry admitted, "that there was something wrong with me. Strange things would happen around me sometimes. Glass would break when I was angry, or my hair would grow back overnight after Aunt Petunia cut it too short. They said it proved I was a freak like my parents." "Those weren't signs that you were a freak," Ted said firmly. "Those were signs that you're a wizard. Magic often manifests in children when they're experiencing strong emotions, especially when they're frightened or upset. It's perfectly normal." "Normal," Harry repeated, as though testing the word. "Completely normal," Andromeda confirmed. "Nymphadora used to change her appearance constantly when she was your age, especially when she was trying to get out of trouble. We'd come home to find a completely different-looking child sitting at the kitchen table, trying to convince us that Nymphadora had gone out to play, and she was just a visiting friend." Harry giggled at the image, and the sound surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed out loud. The front door opened with a cheerful bang, followed by the sound of someone dropping what seemed like a considerable amount of luggage in the hallway. "Mum! Dad! I'm home!" a voice called out, young and exuberant. "In the kitchen, dear," Andromeda called back. The girl who appeared in the doorway was unlike anyone Harry had ever seen. Her hair was a brilliant shade of pink that definitely didn't occur in nature, and her eyes were sparkling with mischief and curiosity. She looked to be about 15 or 16, with the kind of confidence that Harry associated with much older people. "So you're the famous Harry Potter," she said, grinning at him. "I'm Nymphadora Tonks, but you can call me Tonks. Everyone does, except Mum when she's trying to be proper." "It's a perfectly lovely name," Andromeda said, mildly. "It's a perfectly stuffy name," Tonks countered, sliding into the remaining chair at the table. "And anyway, I like Tonks better. It suits me." Harry stared at her in fascination. "Your hair is pink." "Today it is," Tonks said with a grin. "Yesterday it was blue. Tomorrow it might be green, depending on my mood. Watch this." Right before Harry's eyes, her hair began to change color, shifting from pink to purple to bright orange. Her nose shortened and widened, then returned to its original shape. "How did you do that?" Harry breathed. "I'm a metamorph magus," Tonks explained proudly. "It means I can change my appearance at will. Not many people can do it. It's a pretty rare ability." "That's incredible," Harry said, and meant it. "It's also very useful for getting out of detention," Tonks said with a wink, "though I probably shouldn't be telling you that." "Nymphadora," Andromeda said in a warning tone. "What? He's not even at Hogwarts yet. I'm just giving him something to look forward to." As they talked and laughed over dinner, Harry felt something happening inside him that he had never experienced before. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the food or the fire in the hearth, a sense of belonging that made him want to stay at this table forever. These people, this family, were including him in their conversation, asking for his opinions, laughing at his small attempts at humor, treating him like he was someone worth listening to. "Harry," Ted said as they finished eating, "would you like to see your room?" "My room?" Harry repeated. "Well, you'll be staying with us for a while, won't you?" Andromeda said. "We thought you might like a space of your own." The room they showed him was small but bright, with a window that looked out over the back garden. There was a proper bed with a thick quilt, a desk for writing, shelves for books, and a wardrobe for clothes. On the bedside table, someone had placed a small vase with fresh flowers. "It's not much," Ted said, "but it's yours for as long as you want it." Harry sat down on the edge of the bed, running his hands over the soft quilt. He had never had a room before. Not a real room, with a window and a door that closed and space to move around in. The idea that this was his, that these people had prepared it for him, without even knowing whether he would want to stay, was almost too much to process. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "Good," Andromeda said, sitting down beside him. "Harry, I want you to understand something. This isn't temporary unless you want it to be. Ted and I would be honored to have you as part of our family, for as long as you'd like to stay. But if you decide you want something different, that's perfectly fine too. This is about what you want, what makes you feel safe and happy." Harry looked around the room, his room, and then at the two adults who were watching him with such kindness and patience. For the first time in his 8 years of life, he felt like he might actually be home. "I'd like to stay," he said, "if that's really okay." "It's more than okay," Ted said warmly. "It's wonderful." That night, as Harry lay in his own bed in his own room, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a peaceful household, he thought about everything that had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, he had been Harry Potter, the unwanted boy in the cupboard under the stairs. So tonight he was Harry Potter, part of a family that actually wanted him. It was, he thought, as he drifted off to sleep, the best day of his life. Severus Snape had been in the middle of brewing a particularly delicate batch of Veritaserum when the message arrived. The owl that tapped insistently at his dungeon office window was one of Dumbledore's, and the parchment it carried bore the headmaster's familiar script. "Your presence required immediately in my office. The matter concerns Harry Potter and information that may require your expertise." Snape's hand stilled on the silver knife he had been using to prepare moonstone powder. Harry Potter. The boy had been safely tucked away with his Muggle relatives for 7 years, carefully hidden from the wizarding world that would have made him a celebrity before he could walk properly. What could possibly have happened to require Snape's expertise? He sealed his brewing equipment with practiced efficiency and made his way through the castle's corridors to Dumbledore's office. The gargoyle stepped aside at his approach. Dumbledore had clearly been expecting him, and Snape climbed the spiral staircase with growing unease. The scene that greeted him in the headmaster's office was not what he had anticipated. Dumbledore sat behind his desk with an expression of carefully controlled concern, while Professor McGonagall paced near the window with obvious agitation. But it was the object lying on Dumbledore's desk that made Snape's breath catch in his throat. A letter, written on parchment that had yellowed slightly with age. Even from across the room, he could see the neat, careful handwriting that he would have recognized anywhere, in any circumstances, after any amount of time. Lily's handwriting. Severus, Dumbledore said quietly. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. Snape remained standing, his dark eyes fixed on the letter. Where did that come from? Harry found it hidden beneath his cupboard this morning, McGonagall said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. It prompted him to leave his relative's home and make his way to Gringotts, where he accessed his family vault. His cupboard? Snape's voice was dangerously soft. The boy has been living in a cupboard under the stairs, McGonagall continued, apparently determined to lay out all the unpleasant facts. For 7 years. Fed irregularly, lied to about his parents, treated as an unwanted burden. Snape said nothing, but something dangerous flickered in his black eyes. The idea that Lily Evans's son, Lily's child, had been living in such conditions was almost too much to process. The letter, Dumbledore said gently, contains information that we believe you may be uniquely qualified to understand. Lily appears to have employed some form of magical protection or concealment that kept the letter hidden until Harry was old enough to find it. Against his better judgment, Snape moved closer to the desk. The letter was face down, but he could see the Potter family seal pressed into the wax, a seal that should not have been visible to Muggle eyes, should not have survived 7 years of casual handling by people with no magical sensitivity. May I? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dumbledore nodded and turned the letter over. The moment Snape saw Lily's handwriting, clearly visible on the aged parchment, he felt something twist painfully in his chest. The careful loops of her letters, the way she dotted her i's, the slight rightward slant that had always made her script look as though it were leaning forward with enthusiasm. It was exactly as he remembered it from their school days. But more than that, he could feel the magic that surrounded the letter like a subtle aura. This was not simply a piece of parchment that had been hidden beneath a floorboard. This was something that had been protected, preserved, warded with magic so subtle and complex that it would have taken considerable skill to achieve. She used concealment charms, he said quietly, running one finger carefully along the edge of the parchment. Multiple layers of them, woven together in a way that would have hidden the letter from casual detection while preserving it against time and damage. Could you replicate such magic? Dumbledore asked. Possibly, given time and the proper materials. Snape paused, studying the letter more closely. But this level of complexity, this degree of subtlety, Lily was always gifted with charm work, but this is exceptional even for her. The Goblins confirmed that the letter is authentic, McGonagall said. They were able to detect no signs of forgery or tampering. Snape nodded absently. Of course it was authentic. No one could have replicated the particular magical signature that clung to anything Lily Evans touched. Even after 7 years, even filtered through layers of protective magic, her essence was unmistakable. What does it say? He asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Dumbledore handed him the letter without comment. Snape read it slowly, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. She knew, he said finally. She knew that the Dursleys would never tell the boy the truth about his heritage. She planned for the possibility that he might need to seek answers on his own. The question, McGonagall said grimly, is whether we can honor her wishes or whether we must override them in the interest of Harry's safety. Snape looked up sharply. Her wishes? To allow the boy to know the truth about his parents, about his magical inheritance, about his worth, Dumbledore explained. Lily clearly intended for Harry to have access to this information when he was old enough to seek it out. And you disagree with her assessment? I am concerned, Dumbledore said carefully, about the protections that have kept Harry safe for 7 years. Protections that depend upon his continued residence with his blood relatives. Snape read the letter again, more slowly this time, paying attention not just to the words but to the intent behind them. Lily had written this knowing that she might die, knowing that her son might be placed with people who would despise his magical nature. She had taken steps to ensure that he would eventually learn the truth about himself, regardless of what his guardians might tell him. It was exactly the sort of thing Lily Evans would do, practical, determined, and utterly focused on protecting her child's emotional well-being as well as his physical safety. She was right to do this, Snape said quietly. Severus. She was right, Snape repeated, his voice growing firmer. Potter, Harry, deserved to know the truth about his parents. He deserved to know that they died protecting him, not in some mundane traffic accident. He deserved to understand his magical heritage instead of being told that it made him a freak. McGonagall looked surprised by his vehemence, but Dumbledore simply watched with those penetrating blue eyes. The boy is currently staying with Andromeda Tonks, Dumbledore said. She has offered to provide alternative guardianship. Snape considered this. He remembered Andromeda Black had been, before her marriage, from his own school days. She had been several years ahead of him, but her reputation for kindness and integrity had been well established even then. The idea that she would provide a loving home for Lily's son was comforting, in a way that Snape hadn't expected. Mrs. Tonks is a suitable guardian. More than suitable, McGonagall said firmly. She and her husband have successfully raised one magical child already. They understand the challenges involved, and they have made it clear that they genuinely want Harry as part of their family. Snape nodded slowly. The alternative, sending the boy back to people who had kept him in a cupboard and lied to him about his parents, was unthinkable. There is something else, he said, studying the letter once more. The concealment charms Lily used. They were designed to activate when Harry reached a certain level of magical maturity, not when he reached a specific age. The fact that he was able to find this letter now suggests that his magical development is somewhat accelerated. Meaning? Dumbledore asked. Meaning that attempting to suppress or ignore his magical nature, as the Dursleys have apparently been doing, could be actively harmful to his development. Children who are forced to suppress accidental magic often experience problems with magical control later in life. It was a professional opinion, delivered in his usual clinical tone, but underneath the detached assessment, Snape felt a familiar surge of protectiveness. Lily's son deserved better than to have his magical gifts stunted by ignorance and fear. The letter also suggests, he continued, that Lily may have left other protections or provisions for Harry. The concealment work here is sophisticated enough that it would have required significant advance planning. She may have prepared additional safeguards that we are not yet aware of. Such as? McGonagall asked. Additional letters, perhaps. Items that would only reveal themselves when Harry was ready for them. Lily was methodical in her approach to magic. She would not have trusted her son's welfare to a single hidden letter if she could have provided multiple safeguards. The room fell silent as they contemplated this possibility. Finally, Dumbledore spoke. What would you recommend, Severus? Snape looked down at the letter one more time, seeing in the careful script all of Lily's love for her son, all of her determination to protect him in whatever way she could. "I recommend that we honor her wishes," he said quietly. "Harry should be allowed to remain with the Tonks family, where he will be loved and valued for who he is. He should be told the truth about his parents and his heritage. And we should investigate the possibility that Lily left other protections for him, protections that may be more effective than forcing him to live with people who despise the very thing that makes him who he is." As he spoke, Snape realized that he meant every word. For 7 years he had convinced himself that keeping Harry Potter hidden and ignorant was the best way to honor Lily's memory. But this letter, this final communication from the woman whose death still haunted his dreams, had made him understand that true protection meant more than simply keeping the boy alive. Lily had wanted her son to know who he was, to understand his worth, to grow up surrounded by love rather than resentment. And if Severus Snape could do anything to ensure that her wishes were respected, then that was exactly what he intended to do. "Very well," Dumbledore said finally. "We will proceed with Mrs. Tonks as Harry's guardian, with appropriate magical protections to supplement the Blood Ward magic, and we will investigate what other provisions Lily may have made for her son's welfare." As they made plans for Harry's future, Snape found himself thinking not about the danger that might come, but about the letter that Lily had somehow managed to leave for her son across 7 years and countless obstacles. Even in death, she was still protecting her child, still fighting for his right to happiness. It was, Snape thought, exactly what he would have expected from Lily Evans, and it was exactly what Harry Potter deserved. Lucius Malfoy had always possessed an exceptional talent for recognizing opportunity when it presented itself. It was this ability that had allowed him to navigate the treacherous political waters following Voldemort's fall, emerging not only unscathed, but with his influence and wealth intact. And now, as he sat in his study at Malfoy Manor, reading the latest reports from his contacts within the Ministry, he could see that opportunity was presenting itself once again. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the most famous child in the wizarding world, had apparently left his Muggle guardians and was currently residing with the Tonks family. The news had spread through magical London with the speed that only gossip about celebrities could achieve, and Lucius had made it his business to gather every available detail about the situation. The facts, as he understood them, painted an intriguing picture. The boy had discovered some form of hidden correspondence from his mother, had accessed his inheritance at Gringotts without adult supervision, and had been taken in by Andromeda Tonks, formerly Andromeda Black, and therefore connected to some of the oldest and most respected bloodlines in magical Britain. More interesting still were the reports of disagreement among the boy's supposed protectors. Dumbledore had apparently been caught off guard by the child's independence. McGonagall was advocating for alternative guardianship arrangements, and even Severus Snape had reportedly weighed in on the boy's behalf. The unity that had characterized the boy's protection for 7 years was fracturing, and Lucius could smell weakness in the water. "You have that look," Narcissa said from the doorway of his study, her voice carrying a note of resigned familiarity. Lucius looked up from his papers to see his wife entering the room with her usual grace. She was, as always, impeccably dressed and perfectly composed, but he had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in her posture. "What look would that be, my dear?" "The one that means you've identified some political advantage to be gained from someone else's misfortune." She settled into the chair across from his desk, her grey eyes studying his face with uncomfortable accuracy. "I prefer to think of it as recognizing when circumstances align favorably," Lucius said smoothly, "and I would hardly characterize young Mr. Potter's situation as misfortune." From what I understand, he has escaped from what sounds like a rather unpleasant living arrangement and found himself a more suitable family. Andromeda, Narcissa said quietly. Yes, your sister. The one who was disowned for marrying beneath her station, if I recall correctly. Narcissa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Andromeda was disowned for following her heart rather than family expectations. There is a difference. Lucius noted the defensive edge in her voice and filed it away for future consideration. His wife's relationship with her sisters had always been complicated, and the war had only made it more so. Bellatrix was currently rotting in Azkaban. Andromeda had been cut off from the family for nearly 20 years, and Narcissa found herself caught between loyalty to her husband's interests and whatever affection she might still feel for her estranged sister. Regardless of the circumstances of her marriage, Lucius continued, Mrs. Tonks is hardly in a position to provide Harry Potter with the kind of guidance and protection that his status requires. The boy is not simply another magical child. He is a symbol, a public figure whose actions and associations will be scrutinized by the entire wizarding world. And you believe you would be better suited to provide such guidance? Narcissa's tone was carefully neutral, but Lucius could hear the skepticism beneath it. I believe I am better positioned to understand the political and social implications of the boy's choices, Lucius replied. Consider the situation objectively, Narcissa. Harry Potter is the most famous child in our world, heir to significant wealth, and connected by blood and friendship to several of the most powerful magical families in Britain. His guardianship is not simply a matter of providing him with a comfortable home. It is a matter of ensuring that his influence is wielded wisely. He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the perfectly manicured grounds of Malfoy Manor. The Tonks family, while respectable in their own way, lack the social connections and political understanding necessary to guide Harry Potter through the complexities of his position. They cannot provide him with the education in statecraft, the understanding of pure-blood society, the knowledge of how power operates in our world. And you can. I have spent the past 7 years carefully rebuilding my standing in the ministry, cultivating relationships with influential families, positioning myself as a voice of reason and stability in the post-war wizarding world. Lucius turned back to face his wife. Harry Potter's endorsement, his visible association with our family, would solidify that position in ways that gold alone cannot achieve. Narcissa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. And what would Harry Potter gain from such an association? Access to the finest tutors, the most exclusive social circles, the kind of preparation that would allow him to take his rightful place as a leader in wizarding society when he comes of age. Lucius returned to his desk, already composing the letter he would send to request a meeting. Consider his alternatives, Narcissa. He could remain with the Tonks family, living a comfortable but essentially ordinary life. Or he could be guided by those who understand the responsibilities that come with his fame and fortune. He is 8 years old, Lucius, which means he is at precisely the right age to begin learning about the world he will inherit. Children from powerful families begin their political education early. You know this as well as I do. Narcissa stood and moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. I remember what it was like, she said quietly, to have my future decided by adults who were more concerned with political advantage than with my happiness. The comment was pointed, and Lucius chose to ignore it. This is different. Harry Potter's position in society is already established. I am merely suggesting that he be properly prepared to fulfill it. By separating him from the family who actually wants him, and placing him with us instead? By ensuring that his considerable influence is aligned with the right people and the right principles. Lucius picked up his quill, signaling that the conversation was drawing to a close. "I will arrange a meeting with Dumbledore and the other concerned parties. A simple discussion of alternatives, presented in terms of what would be best for the boy's future development. And if Harry himself prefers to stay with Andromeda." "He is 8 years old," Lucius repeated. 8-year-olds are rarely qualified to make decisions about their own long-term interests. That is why they require guidance from adults with more experience and perspective. Narcissa was quiet for several minutes, watching her husband draft his letter with practiced efficiency. Finally, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Andromeda always wanted children," she said. "Even when we were young. She talked about having a large family, about being the kind of mother who would put her children's happiness above everything else." Lucius paused in his writing. "Your point?" "My point is that perhaps Harry Potter needs that more than he needs political connections or social position. Perhaps what he needs is simply to be loved and wanted for himself rather than for what he represents. Love is a luxury, Narcissa. Power is a necessity. Harry Potter was born to wield influence in our world. It would be irresponsible to allow that influence to develop without proper guidance." Narcissa turned away from the window to face her husband fully. "And if your proper guidance makes him miserable, if he would rather live with people who love him than with people who see him as a political asset, then he will learn, as we all do, that personal happiness is often secondary to duty and responsibility." Lucius signed his letter with a flourish. Harry Potter's feelings about his guardianship are less important than ensuring that his influence is used to benefit wizarding society. As he sealed the letter and prepared to send it, Lucius felt the familiar satisfaction that came with recognizing and acting upon opportunity. Harry Potter's guardianship was clearly a matter that required delicate handling, and there were few people better qualified to provide such handling than someone with his experience in navigating the intersection of politics and power. The fact that the boy might prefer to remain with his current guardians was unfortunate, but ultimately irrelevant. Children rarely understood what was best for them in the long term, and Harry Potter's position was too important to be left to the whims of an 8-year-old's emotional preferences. Within the hour, his letter was on its way to Hogwarts, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss alternative arrangements for Harry Potter's care, arrangements that would better serve both the boy's future and the interests of wizarding society as a whole. As Narcissa left his study without another word, Lucius was already planning his approach for the meeting. It would require delicacy, of course, and a careful balance between appearing to serve the boy's interests while advancing his own. But he had navigated far more treacherous political waters in the past, and he was confident that this situation could be resolved to everyone's benefit, most especially his own. The boy who lived needed guidance from those who understood power, and Lucius Malfoy intended to ensure that he provided exactly that. 3 weeks after Harry Potter had first walked into Gringotts with his mother's letter, he found himself sitting in the parlour of the Tonks house, watching the adults around him finalize the arrangements that would determine the course of his future. It was strange, he reflected, how different this felt from those first terrifying hours when he had been caught between Dumbledore's authority and the Goblins' protection. Now, instead of being spoken about, as though he weren't present, the adults kept checking with him to make sure he understood what was being discussed and whether he agreed with the proposed solutions. It was a novel experience, being treated as though his opinions mattered in decisions about his own life. Dumbledore sat in the chair across from him, looking older and more tired than Harry remembered from their first meeting at Gringotts. The headmaster's blue eyes, however, were gentle as they rested on Harry's face. "I want you to understand, Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying none of the stern authority it had held in those first confrontations. that while I may have disagreed with some of the choices that led us here, I have come to recognize that Mrs. Tonks and her family can provide you with something I failed to ensure you had with the Dursleys." "What's that?" Harry asked. "A childhood," Andromeda said, quietly from her place on the sofa. "The right to be loved for who you are, not protected like an object that might break." Dumbledore nodded slowly. "The blood protection that has kept you safe for 8 years is indeed powerful, and it has served its purpose well. But Professor Snape has helped me understand that there are other forms of protection, other ways to keep you safe that do not require you to sacrifice your emotional well-being." "What kind of other protection?" Harry was genuinely curious now. The adults had been having long, complicated discussions about magic and wards and protection spells, most of which went over his head. But he was beginning to understand that they were finding ways to keep him safe that didn't depend on living with people who hated him. "Layered protections," Ted explained, settling into the chair beside his wife. "Different kinds of magic working together. Some tied to the house, some tied to the family, some tied to you yourself as you grow older and stronger. The blood protection from your mother's sacrifice will always be with you," Dumbledore added. "That magic is part of you now, not dependent on where you live. We are simply adding additional safeguards to ensure that you remain safe, while also allowing you to be happy." Professor McGonagall, who had been quietly reviewing a stack of parchments, looked up from her work. "The legal arrangements are quite straightforward, actually. Mrs. Tonks has been approved as your guardian, with full authority to make decisions about your education, your welfare, and your future. The Ministry has accepted the arrangement without objection." Harry looked around the room at the faces of the adults who had spent weeks negotiating for his well-being. It was still difficult to believe that so many people cared about what happened to him, that they had devoted time and effort to ensuring that he would be happy and safe. "What about Mr. Malfoy?" Harry asked. "Andromeda said he wanted to take me away from you." The adults exchanged glances, and Harry caught a flicker of something that might have been amusement in Dumbledore's eyes. "Mr. Malfoy's proposal was considered and rejected," McGonagall said diplomatically. "It was determined that his motivations were perhaps not entirely focused on your well-being. He wanted to use you for political advantage," Andromeda said more bluntly. "To make himself look important by association with you. That is not the same thing as wanting to provide you with a loving home." Harry nodded. Even at 8 years old, he could understand the difference between someone who wanted to help him and someone who wanted to use him. The Dursleys had made him useful by giving him chores and treating him like an unpaid servant. Mr. Malfoy would have made him useful in a different way, but it would still have been about what he could do for other people rather than about his own happiness. "So what happens now?" Harry asked. "Now," Ted said with a smile, "you get to be a normal 8-year-old boy. You'll start learning about magic, of course. Andromeda is quite qualified to begin your magical education. You'll make friends with other magical children. You'll have proper meals and your own room and adults who care about your opinions. You'll also," Dumbledore added, "begin preparing for Hogwarts, though that is still 3 years away. Mrs. Tonks will ensure that you understand your heritage, your family's history, and the responsibilities that may come with your position in the magical world. But those responsibilities will never be more important than your right to be a child," Andromeda said firmly. "You will learn about your legacy and your options, but you will not be forced to make decisions about your future until you are old enough to understand all the implications." Harry thought about this for a moment. "And I can stay here? For real? Not just until someone changes their mind?" "For real," Ted assured him. for as long as you want to stay. This is your home now, Harry. Legally, officially, and most importantly, because we want you here." The room fell quiet for a moment, and Harry felt something settle in his chest that he had never experienced before, a sense of security that went beyond simply being fed and housed. These people wanted him. They had fought for him, negotiated for him, rearranged their lives to make room for him, and they expected nothing in return except for him to be himself. "There is one more thing," Dumbledore said gently. "Mr. and Mrs. Tonks have agreed to allow me to maintain some involvement in your magical education, particularly as you grow older and begin to understand more about your unique circumstances. I hope that in time you might come to see me not as someone trying to control your life, but as someone who cares about your well-being and wants to help you navigate the complexities of growing up in the magical world." Harry studied the old wizard's face. Dumbledore had made mistakes. Harry understood that now, even if he didn't fully grasp all the details. But he could also see genuine regret in those blue eyes, and a desire to do better. "I think that would be all right," Harry said quietly, "as long as you remember that this is my home now." "I will remember," Dumbledore promised. Later that evening, after the adults had finished their discussions and McGonagall and Dumbledore had left, Harry found himself in the kitchen with Ted and Andromeda, helping to prepare dinner. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy, but the act of working together, of contributing to the household in a way that was appreciated rather than expected, filled him with a contentment he had never known existed. "Harry," Andromeda said, as she guided his hands in cutting vegetables, "I want you to know that Ted and I consider ourselves incredibly fortunate to have you as part of our family. Not because of who you are in the magical world, but because of who you are as a person." "What do you mean?" Harry asked. "I mean that you are kind and brave and thoughtful," Ted said, from where he was stirring something on the stove. "You could have become bitter and angry after the way the Dursleys treated you, but instead, you chose to trust us when we offered you kindness. That says something important about your character." Harry felt his cheeks warm with the unfamiliar pleasure of genuine praise. "I just wanted a family. And now you have one," Andromeda said softly. "A family that will teach you about magic, help you understand your heritage, and support you in whatever you choose to do with your future. But most importantly, a family that loves you for exactly who you are." As they sat down to eat together, Harry looked around the table at Ted and Andromeda, at the warm light filling the kitchen, at the sense of peace and belonging that surrounded him like a protective spell. Tomorrow, he would begin learning about the magical world in earnest. He would start to understand the complexities of his heritage and the weight of his fame. He would face challenges and difficulties that he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, he was simply Harry Potter, 8 years old, sitting at his family's dinner table and feeling, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he belonged. The boy who had crawled out of a cupboard under the stairs that morning, 3 weeks ago, was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood his own worth and knew what it felt like to be truly wanted. And while the future might hold complications and difficulties, it would also hold the certainty that he had people who cared about him, who would fight for him, and who would always make sure he had a place to call home. It was, Harry thought, as he listened to Ted and Andromeda's gentle conversation, more than he had ever dared to hope for.